real privilege for me to be the chair in this webinar of the series Law in the Americas. And this is a special because we have two amazing presenters about a very interesting topic concerning copyright. I would like to welcome everyone that is connecting to us. I will just make a couple of housekeeping remarks. The first one is that we will take questions at the end once all the presentations are finished. And for that purpose, there is a Q&A feature on the Zoom. Please use that to post your questions, and we will deal with the questions after the presentations are finished. The second point is that we have an amazing features of Spanish interpretation that you can see down in the screen, in the right part of the screen. If you choose that feature, then you will be able to listen to the webinar in Spanish. And now, without any further remarks, I would like to give the floor to my Dean Andy Strauss from the law school, who will make some introductory remarks, and then I will have the pleasure to present the presenters. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, Professor Bernal. I am very pleased today to introduce our webinar on copyright law featuring our moderator, Dr. Carlos Bernal, and our speakers, Professor Pablo Inello and Professor Tracy Riley. Today's webinar is part of the University of Dayton School of Law's Law in the Americas series with our Latin American partner law schools, and its commentator, and it commemorates, our new partnership with UADE, Universidad Argentina de la Empresa. I'm hopeful that this webinar will be the first in a long series of events between our two faculties that will result in an ever-deepening relationship. Me complace mucho presentar el seminario web de este día en discursos de los derechos de autor con nuestro moderador, el profesor Carlos Bernal, y nuestros oradores, profesor Pablo Inello y profesora Tracy Riley. Entiendo que compartimento el profesor Inello y la profesora Riley es el director de nuestro programa de Derecho y Tecnología. Se llama PILT. El seminario web de hoy es parte de la serie de la Facultad del Derecho en las Américas de la Universidad de Dayton con nuestras facultades del Derecho Latinoamericanos asociados y conmemora nuestra nueva asociación con UADE, la Universidad Argentina de la Empresa. Espero que este seminario web sea el primero de una larga serie de eventos entre nuestras dos facultades que resultaron en una relación cada vez más profunda. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you so much, Dean Strauss, for these words and for your introduction. Now I would like to introduce Professor Pablo Inello. Pablo is the director of the program of Law and Technology at UADE. He is also a visiting scholar at the Unitwa Institute, and he's adjunct professor at the University of Dayton Law School. Then, Professor Inello, you have the floor to make your presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I would like to extend a special thanks to Professor Carlos Bernal for such introduction. Of course, the Dean of the Law School, Andy Strauss, for this great bilingual introduction, and also Professor Tracy Riley for allowing me to share this Law in the Americas event with her. It's such an honor to share the floor with you, Tracy. And as I said, welcome to everybody. As it was properly pointed out by my colleagues, this is one of the series of events of the Law in the Americas, and this one specifically is sponsored by the University of Dayton and UADE, sponsoring the partnership that both universities have reached. So that being said, I'm going to share my screen. hopefully you will be seeing the full screen just in a minute. Um, I will try to sum up some of the ideas on the new frontiers in copyright law and intellectual property rights. This is, of course, this is a huge and a very broad topic. We can spend weeks talking about the different developments that we have seen in the last couple of years in law and technology related to copyright law. So, of course, I'm not covering the entire thing, and I will focus just in a couple of the most interesting, I guess, features of these developments. So let me begin by saying that, of course, new technology brings new forms of creativity. And as probably everybody is aware of, when you are talking about copyright law, you are talking about human creation and creativity. So one of the things that are at the core of the copyright challenge as we speak is that in which sense can we can relate the idea of authorship as an expression of the human mind and the human spirit with new technologies. This is specifically important if you consider artificial intelligence, because of course, artificial intelligence are being programmed in a way that not so far from now, they will be allowed to bring up their own creations. So the human element probably will be missed. So the causality link between the human element and the artificial intelligence or the machine learning at the stage that we have now, it will be too blur. And as a result of that, it will be hard to talk about copyright, at least in the traditional sense of copyright law, or rather term. I mean, I will use copyright here in the English versions, but please let me be flexible that when we are talking about copyright, we can extend the notions, of course, to the continental legal tradition too. Now, related with the topic I just mentioned, we have already some case law, specifically in the European Union. So the European Union is a pretty interesting jurisdiction if you are interested in taking a look on regulation between intellectual property rights and new technologies, because they brought some new interesting regulation to the light. Of course, in data protections, the GDPR, but also in copyright, you have the Digital Market Single Directive. Now, in Spanish, we know that as Directiva Europea de Derechos de Autor, which is part of a broader strategy of the European Union known as the Digital Economy Single Act, okay, which is built in different pillars. One of the pillars is data, the other pillars is copyright, and the third pillar would be free flow of data. Okay, so the European Directive for Copyright is based in several precedents decided by the European Union Court of Justice. One of those precedents was the precedents InfoPac. Okay, this is a very important precedent when you're dealing with law and tech and IP issues, because that was the first case brought into the European Court of Justice, in which the court had to address the issue of whether snippets selected by a highly tech mechanism, basically some kind of algorithm that allow the most important news in different newspaper websites, and they put it together and generate a kind of a newsletter with the most breaking news of the day. So the discussion was if that snippets can be considered copyright. Okay, so the decision of the court was absolutely not, because there is no originality requirement in that process, because it is the result of non-human being. In other words, no human being was involved in creating that newsletter or report or memo or brief of all the news. And then there is no reason in order to grant copyright protection. In this case, we see that the European Court of Justice remain pretty faithful to the idea that copyright is related to human creation. For those of you that are familiar with copyright regulation, you must be aware that the new European Directive on Copyright contain a new neighboring right for press release, for newspapers, okay? Now, do we have any changes in the case law because of the news neighboring right? The answer is no, okay? Snippets are not covered by this neighboring right. So in fact, newspapers are not going to be granted neighboring rights for this kind of machine learning process that are covering the highlights of the news in the different newspapers around Europe, okay? Now, there is another thing perhaps some of you have heard of, and if not, you can Google as I speak. You can see the very short video, which is the new Rembrandt Project. So what's the new Rembrandt Project? So a group of people combining different professions, different fields, from photographers, of course, computer scientists, programmers, art specialists. They wanted to create by machine learning a Rembrandt. Basically, they want to imitate the features that the Dutch painter used to perform when he was painting in the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. So they brought to life a new Rembrandt. So you can take a look. I mean, here in the center of the picture you are seeing, this looks like a Rembrandt, but it was not painted by Rembrandt. It was painted by a kind of artificial intelligence, okay? A very complicated series of algorithms. So that's a portrait. Can we have copyright on that? The answer so far is no. Okay, the authors of the new Rembrandt Project claim no copyright on the portrait, but what if they would have claimed copyright on that? They didn't, but there was a case similar to this one, was not related with paintings, but with photograph, which is the case of Eva Maria. And the European Court of Justice gave us a sense of direction on this. And the conclusion is that if the selection of photograph, or in the Rembrandt Project, portraits, reflect the spirit of the authors, then you can grant copyright protection. Now, if the selection of portrait is a kind of a stochastic process done by the algorithm, then you won't have copyright protection. So again, the underlying reasoning is that are we protecting somehow human expression? If the answer is yes, then you will have access to copyright protection. Otherwise, you won't. Now let me turn to the second topic that I wanted to address, which is not strictly related to copyright, but it's something that is being discussed as we speak. We have a kind of an impasse due to the COVID pandemic, but I think that as soon as the pandemic ends, we will see again new forum discussion. And this is how we protect non-personal data. Okay, most of us are aware of the importance of personal data and the regulations about personal data all over the world. But because of the Internet of Things and the big data, many times, and even more times, machines are sharing data among them. And this is non-traceable data, okay? It's not a data that is expressed in a way that can identify any of us, because it's not semantic data, it's syntactic data. So basically it's expressed in program code, okay? So can we protect that on copyright? The answer is no. This is not related with originality. This is not related with human expression, and it's not a software in itself, it's just trading data. So the discussion is about creating a new intellectual property right about the companies that are processing the data for the effort put in processing that data. this is what is being discussed, okay? There is no regulation so far on this, okay? There are lobby from certain countries and certain specific industries in order to get that, specifically those industries that are intensive in this non-personal data. One of the industries is the automobile industry, the car industry, okay, the car manufacturing industry. Most part of the European academia, as far as I read, is against this. The main reason is that we can have a kind of overlapping rights. And as a result of this, we can create like too much protection on the same object, and we can create a barrier entry. And this might have a kind of adverse effect in one of the pillars that I mentioned, the free flow of data. So a possible approach to this problem is that perhaps so far the conditions are not met yet in order to have the right, which does not mean that in the future this right cannot emerge. Probably, if you can explain this in terms of the technological shifting, the technological path shifting, the thing is that we are still jumping from one technology path to another. So the distribution of property rights are not clear enough so far. Now, if that's the case, then a common property still makes sense. Once that the distributions of rights and the incentives happen to be clearer, then it's likely that we can see an emergence of a new intellectual property rights. For those of you that enjoy game theory and evolutionary game theory, you can see some literature expressing this in evolutionary game theory terminology, which the most important feature here is that you move from one evolutionary stable strategy to another one, okay? And last but not least, before giving the floor to Carlos and then to Tracy, I mentioned the European Directive on copyright, okay? So there are many reasons why the Europeans wanted that directive to be in place. And as far as we speak, I mean, we're approaching the deadline for European countries to implement the directive, because of course it is at the communitarian level. So then each country must be sure to implement the directive in its own regulation. So they have a deadline, and the deadline is coming this year, okay? So there is a kind of a lot of expectation in the European Union. Now, you know that in copyright, you have like two paths in terms of exceptions to copyright, okay? One is that you can create exceptions through case law, like in many common law countries. The other way is that you can create an exception in statutory law, okay? Now, the European Directive contains new exceptions for copyright. Basically, you are not expected to pay any kind of copyright. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that those exceptions include data mining, okay? So this is a clear expression that the Europeans want outside of copyright protection, harvesting data, so that they can guarantee this idea of free flow of data and create eventually a market on data, okay? Because data is harvested from many websites and many features that are protected by copyright law. So the question is, if a machine takes the data from there, the owner of the machine must pay a copyright? The answer is no, okay? The answer is no, okay? So if you are doing Internet of Things, you are doing analytics, and you're harvesting data from different websites protected by copyright, do we have copyright? In that case, the answer is under the European Directive, you don't have to, okay? Well, that could be all on my side. Thank you a lot for your time. I hope that I made myself clear enough, and I would be very happy to answer any question that you can have at the end of the presentation, of course. So I will give the floor to Carlos then.
Thank you so much, Professor Yanela, for this wonderful and interesting presentation. I would like to remind the audience that if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And at the end, the speakers, the panelists will be more than happy to answer those questions. Now, I would like to introduce my colleague, Professor Tracy Raley. She is the NCR Professor of Law and Technology and the Director of the Program in Law and Technology at the University of Dayton School of Law. Professor Raley, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's webinar, especially since I have not seen my good friend Pablo in quite some time due to this pandemic. Thanks also to Andy and Margaret and Walter for making the event possible. So bear with me and I will upload my presentation. Okay, so my presentation is going to view some of the concepts about authorship that Pablo was talking to you about, authorship and the human spirit, essentially from a little bit different of a lens. So I'm going to be examining what I believe are some of the byproducts of our increasingly digital culture, particularly how copyright law has been affected, or in my opinion, has been infected by the social media phenomenon known as cancel culture. So as the title of this presentation suggests, I'm looking at the issue from a variety of multidisciplinary lenses, including George Orwell's famous novel 1984, the French post-modernist movement of the 1960s, of course, cancel culture and copyright law. Strange bedfellows they seem. So the formula takes shape within this piece. And by the way, this presentation is based on an article, a law review article that I just completed and which will soon be submitted for publication. But the formula looks something like this. Back in the 20th century, 1947, 1948 to be precise, George Orwell, in writing his famous and iconic novel 1984, as well as other books and lesser known articles, essentially predicted the social movements that were going to arise in the postmodern era, post-war era in Europe. So after the great worldwide experiment of Marxism would prove to be an abject failure, in fact, a disastrous failure that led to millions of deaths worldwide, Orwell understood somehow that the folks who were still dedicated to the underlying precepts of Marxism, particularly what he called the British intelligentsia, meaning the academics of the age, would essentially get to work right away and start repackaging or reconfiguring the Marxist philosophy in an attempt to unleash it into the modern world in another skin, so to speak. And that's exactly what happened in France beginning in the 1960s when we saw French postmodernists create a movement led largely by figures such as Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, and Michel Foucault, unleashing this philosophy in which they sought to dismantle, or in their terminology, to deconstruct all of the Cartesian principles of Western society that had been firmly in place since the age of the Enlightenment, vehemently attacking notions such as reason, logic, even fact and science. So I believe that this movement essentially set the stage perfectly for current platforms such as cancel culture, which is of course, the digital platform that allows for massive collectivist assault on any individual who dares to get in the way of or object to the ideological tenets of what I consider to be a radical postmodern branch of leftism. So how does all this relate to copyright? Well, copyright scholars pretty quickly jumped on the postmodernist bandwagon, starting primarily around the early 1990s, even the late 1980s, essentially taking works of the postmodernists and using them to support a deconstructionist view of the author, the copyright author, the notion that is so important to copyright jurisprudence in the United States. So important, in fact, that the founders of the United States Constitution saw fit to acknowledge the necessity of providing authors of copyrighted works the exclusive rights to the intellectual products of their labor and their creation to recoup and enjoy the success of their labors, albeit for limited times. Now, that notion is also reflected in Section 201 of the Copyright Act, which states that copyright ownership will initially vest in the author or authors of the work. And also we see it reflected in perhaps the pinnacle, the most important provision in the United States Copyright Act, and that's Section 106, that provides the menu of exclusive rights that are available to the copyright author and the author and the owner of the copyrighted work. And that includes rights such as to exclusively reproduce, copy, distribute, prepare works that are based on the original work, and so forth. Now, it wasn't until 1884, the notion of authorship seemed pretty straightforward, and it wasn't until 1884 that a court had the opportunity to actually define the term authorship, which had remained undefined in the Copyright Act, and by the way, still is not defined in today's 1976 version of the Copyright Act. So Burrough-Giles Court said, the author is he to whom anything owes its origin, originator, maker, or one who completes a work of science or literature. So we see from both the constitutional, the legislative, and the judicial branches in the United States, the notion of authorship being integral to what it means to have a copyrighted work and to protect the author of that copyrighted work, employing natural rights theories based largely on John Locke's theory that was so influential to the founding fathers. And basically Locke believes that because all humans possess a natural right to the fruits of their own labor, including the expression of their creative activities, then the law should follow by ensuring that no one will be deprived of what they have earned by either force or fraud. And that means from individual folks as well as the government. So what does that all have to do with postmodernism? Well, in the 1960s, the postmodernists largely attacked these post-Enlightenment natural rights theories-based notions of the author that were so important, not only to US copyright law, but to copyright law in all common law countries. The postmodernists, what did they attempt to do? Well, they said that when we interpret any text, the writing of that text and its creators are not related at all. The author is not a genius originator of great works that are original and iconic to them, but they're simply demoted to scripters who just go around and collect or reassemble pre-existing material that has been generated in the past. So authors, essentially, according to the postmodernists, they are not able to create. They're not even able to decide the meaning of their own work. So the task of this meaning falls somewhere else in the destination, the reader, i.e. the collective public. The postmodern deconstruction of the author was led largely by Michel Foucault, who wrote his influential article in 1968 called "What is an Author?" So Foucault claims in this work that we must entirely reverse the traditional idea of the author. We're accustomed to saying that the author is this genial creator of a work in which he deposits with wealth and generosity an inexhaustible world of significations. We're used to thinking the author is so different from all other men, so transcendent, that as soon as he speaks, meaning begins to proliferate and to proliferate indefinitely. So we can see a very resentful attitude here toward genius authors of the past instituted by Michel Foucault here, who goes on to say, the truth is, in fact, the contrary. The author is not an indefinite source of significations that fill a work. The author does not precede the work. He is a certain functional principle by which one impedes the free circulation, the free manipulation, composition, decomposition, and recomposition of fiction. So academic scholars really began jumping on this bandwagon in order to attack the notion, particularly of the copyright author and how the copyright author stands constitutionally, legislatively, and appears throughout our judicial opinions. For example, Professor Lionel Bentley claims, hailing Foucault, saying Foucault urged us to imagine a culture where discourse would circulate without any need of an author. And Barthes, his companion in crime, my words, went one step further by saying that the author is irrelevant. So what Professor Bentley imagines is a time in which individual authorship of works will be replaced by what he calls intertextuality. Now, he never defines what that means or why that's better from our current copyright regime. But when indeed I started to review more and more of what my copyright colleagues were writing in this area, I noticed that there was a common theme. And that was that copyright rights, which we have traditionally granted to individual authors who create works of originality, should not be given to them. The rights should not be given to the authors, but instead should be conferred to the public, according to Professor Ziemer, or according to Professor Burke, some other often invisible contributors to the work. So I don't know if he's thinking about ghosts or specters, but he never defines what that means, of course. And in order to, well, why do copyright scholars want this? Well, in order to, what they say in their words, to achieve the ability of the public to secure collective interests. Again, that's Professor Ziemer. Professor Barron says cultural rights should reign supreme, or the many social dimensions of creativity. Professor Jazzy goes as far to say, in arguing for what he terms collaborative cultural production and polyvocal writing, whatever that means, he leaves it undefined, but goes as far as saying that this persistence of the notion of authorship in American copyright law makes it difficult for a new legal synthesis, which would focus on the reality of collective creativity to emerge. So obviously this new regime that is promulgated by the copyright professors vis-a-vis by way of attacking the copyright author becomes an ideological battle between precepts of individualism that are extolled in our laws in the United States versus hearkening back to a collectivist mindset or even socialistic, and in my view, what I've come to realize, even a post-Marxist view. So I looked at this for several years, and I've written 2 previous articles before this one, and I was trying to figure out how it is that copyright professors are using this death of author mantra that is promulgated by the postmodernists, such as Michel Foucault, as a mechanism to accomplish what I believe is the goal of this vast cultural shift, taking away copyright rights from individuals and placing them for fair use in the collective. So in my first article, I looked at it from a philosophical lens, studying existentialist philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Soren Kierkegaard, and Jose Ortega y Gasset. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, so my apologies for that. And then in Copyright in a Synergistic Society, I looked at it from the lens of behavioral psychologists. But I was still left really perplexed. I understood how copyright professors were using the death of authorship to merge into this collectivist mindset, but I didn't understand why. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out why. So I kept searching, and my research question during my sabbatical became why? Why do radical postmodern intellectuals personally wage personal attacks upon this notion of the romantic, or God forbid we should say genius authors of the past? And a perfect example is Professor Ann Barton, who claims that Romanticism is an outdated ideology in which artists are held up as uniquely sensitive souls who are valiantly transcending the prosaic routines and necessities of everyday life to express their genius in works of the imagination. And I'm thinking, why such personal, visceral attacks? Well, it wasn't until things started coming together for me was when I enrolled as a student actually in a course at our university called 20th Century British Literature. And I read, or I should say reread 1984. I hadn't read it since high school, of course. So if you're not familiar with the George Orwell's iconic novel, it's basically a novel, a fiction that depicts a future dystopian society known as Oceania, in which our Western tradition and rule of law has been forcefully replaced by a totalitarian dictatorship known as INGSOC, which was Orwell's shortened term for English socialism, famously known as Big Brother, or nicknamed as Big Brother. Now, one of the ways that INGSOC kept its subjects, the residents of Oceania, in check was by falsifying and literally rewriting all the records and histories of the past, including all the great literature and science that had been products of the Enlightenment and that were the products that the constitutional founders had their mind on when creating the Progress Clause of the United States Constitution. And this should sound familiar to you all because I think that's essentially what our world leaders in great force are attempting to accomplish on a wide scale. So the residents of Oceania, they're basically monitored by 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by these two-way monitors that are placed and perched in every aspect of every segment of their existence and including in their private homes. So if any resident of Oceania in any way deviated or became a detractor from the ideologies of Big Brother, they were essentially wiped out, or what we might call today, they were canceled. So in one of the early passages in the book, Orwell states that once you were in the grip of the party, what you felt or did not feel, what you did or refrained from doing made literally no difference. Whatever happened, you vanished, and neither you nor your actions were ever heard of again. You were lifted clean out of the stream of history. In effect, you were canceled, right? So the novel, and I hate to, there's some spoilers here. I'll try not to spoil too much of it for those of you who haven't read it. But the novel essentially follows the path of protagonist Winston Smith, who is essentially a middle-class member of INGSOC who is employed by the government, by the party, in order to work at the Ministry of Truth, where he takes newspaper articles, pieces of literature, science, newspapers, and so forth, and crumples them up and throws them down a pneumonic tube where they are burned and forever destroyed. And then he rewrites the history in accordance with the ideologies promulgated by Big Brother. So Winston eventually becomes a detractor of the party and is captured by INGSOC and severely tortured throughout the second half of the novel by O'Brien, who's pictured here in the movie version, until Winston finally is broken by his torturers and not only just says that he believes in and loves Big Brother, but actually has a true change of heart. So Winston, throughout this novel, was asking essentially the same question that I was asking when I was starting my research. Why is it that this regime of INGSOC chose to replace our individualistic, our freedom-oriented Western societies with a regime of collectivism and totalitarianism? So in his words in the novel, Winston states that what most affected him with this sense of nightmare was that he had never clearly understood why the huge imposture of INGSOC was undertaken. The immediate advantages of falsifying the past were obvious, but the ultimate motive was mysterious. He took up his pen again and wrote, "I understand how, but I do not understand why." So when Winston is questioning his torturer, and he and O'Brien are having a discourse, he asked O'Brien why. And he knew in advance, and this is from the book, he knew in advance what O'Brien would say, that the party did not seek power for its own ends, but only for the good of the majority. That it sought power because men in the mass were frail, cowardly creatures who could not endure liberty or face the truth, and therefore must be ruled over and systematically deceived by others who were stronger than themselves. So this is what Winston predicted O'Brien would tell him the reason for Ingsoc. And then the great reveal of the novel, and again, I apologize for the spoiler, is that is O'Brien's response. O'Brien says, "Now I will tell you the answer to my question. It is this: the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested only in power, not wealth, not luxury or long life or happiness, only power, pure power." And if that doesn't chill you to the bone, my friends, I'm not sure that anything will. So, and this is revealed, and I started seeing this when I went back and reread some of the things that my copyright scholars were saying in their law review articles. And this one is particularly egregious in my estimation because it comes from a student of one of these postmodern, radical, in my opinion, academics. So Mr. Fukumoto says, "Deconstruction is the name of the project to undermine the author, the individual, and consciousness. Deconstruction does not mean destroying the structure of Western thought. That may indeed be the eventual goal, but it cannot be achieved all at once. Instead, deconstruction seeks to weaken the structure by employing the tools of Western thinking against itself." Again, extremely chilling that this is what our students are being taught in law school. So in the bulk of the article, and I know I'm running out of time, so I can't go through the entire slide presentation, but what I do is I essentially pull out the main iconic themes. Many of you probably recognize some of them: doublespeak, newspeak, 2 + 2 = 5, and 2 minutes hate, and so forth. And I show how the radical postmodern movement today has worked to achieve, largely through cultural movements and platforms like cancel culture, widespread collectivist and even Marxist type censorship and an erasure of culture in order to, again, advance on a worldwide scale the deconstruction of Western enlightened thought. Of course, as you can imagine, I believe that this is a terrible idea. And I state in the conclusion of my article that in order for copyright to continue to work in bringing about products that advance the progress of our civilization, we've got to stop this destructive movement from eviscerating the metaphorical and practical importance of the author. So like Pablo, I'm happy to address any questions that the audience may have about this piece. Thank you.
Tracy, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I think so far we don't have questions in the Q&A feature. If one of the participants, if anyone would like to pose a question there, please feel free to do it. But for now, I wonder if Pablo and Tracy would like to share a couple of comments on each other presentations. Maybe while the participants ask questions, that would be great. I wonder if Tracy would like to say something about Pablo's excellence.
Sure. So the piece that I took out of Pablo's that I think relates directly, or maybe perhaps indirectly, to some of the notions that I explore in my article is when Pablo talked about the notion of authorship and the human spirit, right? I think that's a really important notion to keep in mind, because if we start shifting notions of individual authorship to these unknown, undefined, and in Pablo's case, unhuman manners of production, then we're essentially losing a great piece of our civilization that I think our founding fathers presciently believed were probably the most important piece, right? So copyright authorship is important on many levels, but probably mostly important on a spiritual, human, or soul, or in the notion of a logos and creation of something really bigger than ourselves. So I think it goes without saying that some of the concerns that Pablo was talking about, that the European Directive is looking at, and we're all looking at worldwide, is what's going to happen when we start replacing authors. It's one step worse than replacing individual authors with collectives. Now we're going from collectives to robots, right? So I think some of the concepts that Pablo brought up are really relevant to my work as well. So I appreciate your treatment of those, Pablo.
Well, thank you very much for that kind comment, Tracy. I really love your presentation. I mean, the topic is really great. The project that you're conducting and your research is really great, and the way that you combine these post-structuralist authors with a kind of a traditional topic like can be copyright is great. Some of the thing I was thinking while I was listening to your presentation is that I think that there is a kind of a confusion that I think that the philosophers like that you quote, like Foucault, Barthes, might have, is like one thing is the problem that you can have with copyright as a way of expressing the idea of authorship, and the way that relates to Romanticism as a movement that, of course, like any kind of movement, may have a moment and then it might pass. But then I think that by no means imply the idea of replacing copyright, because we have different theories of copyright, and one of the theories is not just the idea of expression; it's also incentives, but not incentives in economic terms only, also in economic terms, but also in terms of expressions. We need humans to create, and the idea of protecting human expression, I think, is part of any kind of legal system. So we must protect, in a way, can be copyright, can be other way. I mean, I'm not rejecting other ways, but we must protect the idea of human flourishing by allowing people to express themselves in some way. And copyright is one of those possibilities, and I think you make a clear point on that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you're not you are potentially accepting of looking at other regimes, and that it's a point that I make as well. And I think I take umbrage with the copyright scholars whom I cite in the paper, many more in the paper than I had the chance to convey on the slide presentation. I think one of the biggest problems I have with their work is they don't offer anything other but destruction, right? They don't even offer real reasons why the author needs to be deconstructed, other than what I can see permeating in the background of just an abject resentment of how genius authors have been portrayed throughout the centuries, but they don't offer anything to take its place. They don't explain what they mean when they throw out terms like polyvocal authorship or intertextuality or cultural production. Those things are abstract concepts. And of course, collectives don't create, individuals create, right? A collective does not create a work like War and Peace. It just doesn't happen. So my issue is, tell me, I'm not so closed-minded as to think that maybe copyright is, it definitely has its problems, right? We acknowledge that, and copyright jurisprudence is consistently about looking at balancing the rights of authors on the one hand versus the rights of the collective and everybody else to use those products and benefit and build on those products. That goes without saying. But before you dismantle a regime that has essentially worked, albeit imperfectly, for hundreds of years, you ought to have something that you're able to well articulate why it's better and why it should be dismantled. And I just quite haven't seen that yet.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I wonder if Pablo would like to wrap up with some comment.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with Tracy, what she's mentioning. I think that if we take a look, not only in copyright, but generally speaking on IP, intellectual property right history, you can bring to the discussion table like patents, trademarks. I mean, they all them came to birth when we have a certain way of organizing a society. I mean, we cannot deny that probably, maybe in the near future, we will see certain type of evolution of those rights. I mean, I think that none of us are pretending that we maintain the status quo forever. I mean, that can be unrealistic. But as Tracy properly says, I mean, if you want to change something, you must provide a kind of a certain amount of reasons to say why, which would be like the cost of benefit of replacing that, and showing that at least you are bringing something new for the benefit of the society. I agree on Tracy on that there's, at least in the deconstruction mode, this is not happening. Okay, I think that we can have another panel in order to explain why it might not be happening. But as I said, this is for another panel.
Okay, thank you so much, Pablo. I don't think we have questions today from the participants. Then I would like to introduce Margaret Ionares to the audience. She is the director of the online LLM here at the University of Dayton. And Margaret would like to present some of the features of that program that might be of interest of the audience. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you, Professor Bernal, and thank you, Professors Riley and Ianello, for your excellent presentations. Bienvenidos a todos los participantes y muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad de presentar más información sobre nuestro programa de Maestría en Derecho en Línea de la Universidad de Dayton. As Professor Bernal mentioned, I'm the program director, and as such, I oversee all aspects of the online LLM program, starting from recruitment through to graduation. I also have the privilege of getting to work closely with all of our online LLM students and our online LLM professors, one of whom is Professor Ianello. University of Dayton School of Law is an accredited law school in the United States. We are accredited by the American Bar Association, and historically the university has offered an LLM in American and transnational law on campus at the University of Dayton campus in Dayton, Ohio, which is located in the Midwest in the United States. Starting in 2019, we also began to offer a fully online LLM option. This allowed us to expand both the accessibility of the program and the affordability of the program. Students do not have to travel to the United States. No visas are required. The entire degree, including all of the exams, can be pursued online. We also offer generous partial tuition scholarships, making our online program one of the most affordable in the United States. As additional background, an LLM degree is a Master of Laws, and this is a graduate degree in law. LLM degrees are typically specialized in a particular field, and University of Dayton's LLM degree is in American and transnational law. The online curriculum is focused on US law and legal practice. Whether students pursue the degree on campus or online, they get exactly the same LLM diploma, and the transcripts and degree do not reflect the online program as an online LLM. The program can be completed within 1 year or less. It consists of 12 courses, and they're offered during 3 semesters per year, January, May, and August. Our next semester actually begins on August 23rd, and for anyone who might be interested in learning more or for applying, the deadline for that is July 23rd. We have about 60 students actually in the program right now from all over the world. Most of our students are working full-time and or pursuing other degrees concurrently. The online LLM track has very broad appeal for those students who are interested in getting a better understanding of common law and US law in particular, as well as those students that are interested in networking and expanding their connections to lawyers and professors for around the world. The LLM course of study online is especially beneficial if you are interested in careers in transnational practice areas, including investment law, tax law, intellectual property, law and tech, and other similar fields. Also, for those of you who might be interested in obtaining a US bar license, our online LLM program does also provide a pathway to bar eligibility in certain states for qualified applicants. More specifically, our curriculum is aligned with the legal education requirements for the California bar exam, the Washington State bar exam, and we are also looking at additional bar eligibility options in Washington, DC, and other jurisdictions. If you'd like any additional information about the online LLM program, you can visit our website at go.udayton.edu/online LLM, or you can reach out to me directly or my colleague, Walter Hawes, who works closely with students from our international partnerships. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'll turn things back over to you, Professor Bernal.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I would like to just wrap up this seminar, first in English and then in Spanish, by thanking Dean Strauss and our two wonderful presenters, Tracy and Pablo, for these amazing discussions on copyrights and also the significance concerning cultural, philosophical, and constitutional aspects. And then let me say a couple of things in Spanish. Yo sé que muchas de las personas que están conectados en el seminario de hoy vienen de Argentina, puedo ver los nombres. Quisiera decir en nombre de la Universidad de Dayton que a nosotros esta asociación con la UADE nos honra muchísimo, que Pablo en su calidad de doble profesor es una persona muy importante tanto para la UADE como para la Universidad de Dayton. Y quisiera sobre todo invitar a los participantes a venir a Dayton, a permitirnos que los entrenemos, bien sea en el programa online que Margaret ha presentado o en algunos de los programas que tenemos aquí presenciales. Una de las fortalezas precisamente de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Dayton es Derecho y Tecnología, que está en desarrollo en todo el continente americano y también en Europa, como Pablo muy bien lo mostró. La profesora Tracy Riley es una de las estrellas en Estados Unidos en relación con la investigación en este tema, y para nosotros pues es un privilegio tenerla aquí en nuestra facultad. Así que yo quisiera pues animarlos a aprovechar este convenio de colaboración internacional que existe entre UADE y la Universidad de Dayton para venir a entrenarse con nosotros. Pues muchas gracias a todos por estar conectados. Ahí, si ustedes ven en la página web, hay otros webinars que están anunciados. El próximo creo que es en el mes de agosto. Es también sobre aspectos muy interesantes que tienen que ver con derechos de autor y con patentes y con tecnología y con la pandemia un poco. Y en lo sucesivo en el año tendremos varios más hasta diciembre. Así que yo los animo a que se inscriban y a que nos acompañen en esos seminarios. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you also to the interpreters. And I just would like to wish you a good weekend. All the best.